Hey everyone, in this video I will show you Bible proof that the blessed Israel that God spoke of in the Bible is not the country in the Middle East. We all know that Genesis 12 says the Lord will bless those who bless the nation of Israel and curse those who curse the nation of Israel. So at first glance, some look at that and think it refers to the modern-day country of Israel that was created in 1948, but that's not true. This is explained in more detail in Deuteronomy 30. Verse 7 again repeats that the Lord will put the curse on those who hate the Israelites. But verse 4 is extremely important in understanding this. It says the Lord is going to gather them from heaven before they return back to their homeland. It says, if any of thine be driven out to the outmost parts of heaven, from thence will the Lord thy God gather thee, and from thence will he fetch thee. In other words, from heaven the Lord will gather them. And the Lord thy God will bring thee into the land which thy fathers possessed, and thou shalt possess it, and he will do thee good, and multiply thee above thy fathers. So in Deuteronomy 30 verses 1 through 7, it provides a mini timeline. It starts out saying, and it shall come to pass when all these things are come upon thee, the blessing and the curse. So that makes it clear that both the blessing and the curse have to happen first. Then verse 2 says, then they will return to the Lord and obey the commandments. And then in verse 3, it says God will return and gather them from all the nations, and will also gather them from heaven. So this event is God's return and the gathering of the elect from both the earth and heaven in Mark 13 and Matthew 24. This is part of Jesus' timeline, and this event does not occur until after the 1260-year tribulation. It occurs at the meteorite impact, which starts a final 3.5-year time of trouble, and that's the end. So there's no possible way that 1948 represented the Israelites being gathered back to their homeland. Deuteronomy is very clear that they will be gathered by God and taken from heaven back to their homeland. So the true nation of Israel that God spoke of in the Bible has not yet returned to their homeland. So remember, Revelation tells us there are those who are claiming to be Jews who are not really the true Jews. So who are the true descendants of Jacob? Well, in order to understand who exactly is going to be gathered in Deuteronomy 30, we need to go back. In verse 1, it says, this gathering will occur when all these things come upon thee, the blessing and the curse. Well, chapter 28 tells us what the blessing and the curse are. And by the way, this is Moses giving the law to the Israelites 40 years after they escaped from Egypt. It goes through 27 chapters of law, and in chapter 28 it says, and it shall come to pass, if thou shalt hearken diligently unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe and to do all his commandments, which I command thee this day, that the Lord thy God will set thee on high above all the nations of the earth, and all these blessings shall come upon thee. Then it goes through all the blessings. Then verse 15 starts with a curse. It says, but it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes, which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee. So we know they received the curses because they strayed. We're told that over and over throughout the text. And Moses himself knew they would not follow the law, even before he died. He said in chapter 31, verse 29, for I know that after my death you will utterly corrupt yourselves, and evil will befall you in the latter days. So chapter 28 lays out what some of the curses will be, and among these we're told the rain in their land will be powder and dust, they will be removed into all the earth, they will be oppressed, and they will be sold into slavery. So remember, they are being told this after they left Egypt, so it's not talking about their slavery in Egypt, it's talking about something in the future. And specifically, Moses said the evil will befall them in the latter days. So in the end of days, it says they will be sold into slavery and brought into a nation their fathers did not know. So again, it's not talking about their slavery in ancient Egypt. It's talking about somewhere else. It says the stranger will be high above them and they will be brought down low. They will serve their enemies naked with a yoke of iron around their necks. It says the nation against them is swift as the eagle. So that's not ancient Babylon either, because ancient Babylon was the lion with wings. So this is not referring to the Babylonian captivity. It says they will experience all the diseases and plagues of Egypt, but again, this place is not ancient Egypt, it's somewhere else. And it says they will be scattered from one end of the earth to the other and brought again into Egypt with ships and sold into slavery. So a lot of people think this refers to the captivity in ancient Babylon, but it doesn't, because it says they will be scattered from one end of the earth to the other before they are brought again into Egypt with ships. So again, this is not Egypt in the Middle East, because it tells us it is a nation their fathers did not know, and they have to travel there by ships. And Revelation 11 tells us in verse 8 that there is a great city in the end time, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt. So in Deuteronomy 28, we're told they will be taken into slavery again into Egypt by ships, but it's a place their fathers did not know. So it has to be referring to the place that Revelation says represents spiritual Egypt. So before we move on, let's just chart this. In Deuteronomy 28, the Israelites are told after they left Egypt that if they do not keep the covenant, they will be cursed, and Moses says the evil will befall them in the latter days. Then in chapter 29, he says, "Keep therefore the words of this covenant." But notice he says in verse 14, "Neither with you only do I make this covenant, but also with him that is not here with us this day." So this covenant doesn't just apply to them, but others. Then it says in verses 22 and 23 that the generation to come of your children that shall rise up after you, and the stranger that shall come from a far land, shall say, when they see the plagues of that land and the sicknesses which the Lord hath laid upon it, and that the whole land thereof is brimstone, like the overthrow of Sodom and Gomorrah. Then it mentions the wrath. So we already know the wrath refers to the meteorite, and Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed by fire and brimstone that rained down from heaven. It says in Luke 17 that in the day the Son of Man is revealed, fire and brimstone will rain down from heaven, just like it did on Sodom and Gomorrah. That's the meteorite, the burning stone that falls from heaven and hits the Sea of Babylon, opens the pit, and darkens the sky for 3.5 years. Okay, so let's chart some key points from chapter 29. It says the generation to come will see the brimstone and burning like Sodom and Gomorrah. In other words, it's talking about the generation that will be alive in the end time when the meteorite hits, which is the wrath of God. We're told in the book of Daniel and Revelation and in Jesus' timeline in Matthew 24 that the meteorite will hit at the end of a 1260-year period and the start of a final 3.5-year period. It seems clear that Deuteronomy is referencing the meteorite, which means the final 3.5 years occur after that. Then chapter 30 says, "And when all these things come upon thee, the blessing and the curse, then God will return and gather thee from all the nations, and gather thee from heaven, and from heaven they will go back into the land their fathers possessed." So let's put those key points in Deuteronomy chapter 30 on the chart. When these things happen, the blessing and the curse, God will return and will gather them from all nations. Some will be gathered from heaven, and from heaven they will return into the land their fathers possessed. And it adds again, those who hate them will be cursed. So it's saying those who hate those who return back to earth from heaven. It's talking about the bride here. It's saying those who hate the bride will be cursed. So this is again another clear reference to the return in Matthew 24, when every eye shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds, and the angels gather the elect from heaven. Again, this occurs on Jesus' timeline after 1290 years, 1260 years, and 70 years. So now it seems clear that it's saying the true Israelites will not return into the land of their fathers until after the rescue, until after the elect are gathered and taken to heaven for 3.5 years. These are the nation of Israel, that those who bless them will be blessed, and those who curse them will be cursed. This nation is not the country in the Middle East. It is a nation that is right now scattered throughout the whole earth. They have not been brought back into their homeland yet, because the Lord said they will be brought back from heaven. So they have to be rescued first. That means the meteorite apocalypse has to happen first before the true nation of Israel will return to their homeland. Ezekiel 5 clarifies some of this as well. It says, "Now, Son of Man, divide the hair," and it's talking about the house of Israel. And it says, "Thou shalt burn with fire a third part in the midst of the city when the days of the siege are fulfilled, and thou shalt take a third part and smite about it with a knife, and a third part thou shalt scatter into the wind, and I will draw out a sword after them. Thou shalt also take thereof a few in number, and bind them, and cast them into the midst of the fire, and burn them in the fire. A fire shall come forth into all the house of Israel." This is Jerusalem. So Ezekiel confirms a few things here. First and foremost, it's referring to the house of Israel, which it says is Jerusalem. So some will look at that and immediately think it's self-explanatory. It's talking about an event in the Middle East, in Jerusalem, but that's not correct, because Jesus told us the house of Israel is the whole world. In Mark 16, Jesus said to the apostles, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature." And in Matthew 10, Jesus said, "Go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel preaching." And in verse 23 of Matthew 10, he says, "You shall not have gone over the cities of Israel till the Son of Man be come." So think about that for a minute. He said that roughly 2,000 years ago. So he was basically telling them it would take them over 2,000 years to preach the gospel throughout all the cities of Israel. There is no way it would take them that long to preach the gospel in the modern country of Israel. It's tiny. He was talking about the whole world. In Jesus' Matthew 24 timeline, he said the end will not come until the gospel has been preached throughout all the world. So Jesus told us himself that the house of Israel represents the whole world. He told them they will not have gone over the cities of Israel till the Son of Man comes. In other words, it will take them at least 2,000 years to go over the cities of Israel. Why? Because the whole world is the house of Israel. Revelation tells us there are those who say they are Jews but lie. We already know the country in the Middle East that was named Israel by humans was established by the beast. It's not true Israel. It's not what God named Israel. The whole earth is God's Israel. So in Ezekiel 5, when it says a fire will come into the house of Israel, it refers to the whole earth. And 2 Peter confirms that. The whole earth will burn in the day of the Lord. Ezekiel also says the house of Israel is Jerusalem. So if the house of Israel is the whole earth and the house of Israel is Jerusalem, then true Jerusalem also covers the whole earth. We're told New Jerusalem is the name of the bride in Revelation 21. It says New Jerusalem will descend out of heaven as a bride after that final time of trouble and at the beginning of the 1,000 years that God will rule on the earth. The bride is the multitude of all tribes and nations that will be taken to the throne when the meteorite hits and return to earth after 3.5 years. They are the multitude that will walk the holy city in heaven for 42 months. Therefore, the true nation of Israel, who will be gathered from heaven and return to their homeland, the earth, is the bride. It's the multitude of all tribes and nations. So those who attack Jerusalem are attacking the bride. It's those who are persecuted in the end time that it's talking about. It's not talking about a country in the Middle East. Those who hate the bride, those who hate the multitude that is going to be rescued, they are the ones that are cursed. So the house of Israel, Jesus said, is the whole earth, and we know the bride is scattered throughout the earth, and the bride is New Jerusalem. So Ezekiel says, divide the hair, which refers to the house of Israel, which is the whole earth. In other words, divide the whole earth into 3 parts. One part will be burned, the other part will go through war, and the other part will be scattered into the wind. The wind here refers to the 4 winds in Matthew 24. It says the angels will gather the elect from the 4 winds from one end of heaven unto the other. So Ezekiel 5 is telling us that 1/3 of the house of Israel is the bride. And the city refers to Babylon the Great, that great city that covers the whole earth in the end time. Some Christians think end-time Babylon will be rebuilt in the Middle East. That is not true, and we know that for several reasons. First, Jeremiah tells us when Babylon falls, the slain will lie unburied over the whole earth. Second, because Revelation tells us Babylon sits on the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns, and Daniel tells us the beast with 10 horns devours the whole earth. So if Babylon sits on the beast, and the beast covers the whole earth, then Babylon the Great sits on the whole earth. Therefore, the 7 mountains that Babylon sits on are the 7 continents. So in Ezekiel 5, the house of Israel, the whole earth, will be split into 3 sections, and the city, which again covers the whole earth, will be burnt. The 3 sections of the earth are also mentioned in Revelation 8, verses 10 and 11. And the 3rd angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp, and it fell upon the 3rd part of the rivers and upon the fountains of waters. And the name of the star is called Wormwood. And the 3rd part of the waters became wormwood, and many men died of the waters. So the meteorite, it says, will poison the waters in 1/3 of the earth. And in verse 12 it says, and the 3rd part of the sun was smitten, and the 3rd part of the moon, and the 3rd part of the stars. So as the 3rd part of them was darkened, and the day shone not for a 3rd part of it. In other words, for a 3rd part of the earth. In Revelation 9, we're told the reason the sun, moon, and stars go dark is because of the star that falls from heaven. It opens a bottomless pit, and smoke comes out of the pit, and the sun is darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit. Then we're told an army goes in and kills the third part of men in verse 15. So again, the meteorite will hit in the third part of the earth. In Revelation 12, we're told a third part of the stars will fall to earth. Again, that refers to the third part of the earth where the meteorite hits. There are several layers to that. So Ezekiel is mentioning the three parts of the earth also, except this time it refers to the hair, which are the people of the earth. The earth itself will be split into three sections when that meteorite hits, and the people will also be separated into three groups. Also notice in Revelation 16 it says, "And there was a great earthquake, such as was not since men were upon the earth, and the great city was divided into three parts. And great Babylon came into remembrance, and there fell upon men great hail out of heaven." So this is talking about Great Babylon. It's saying the great city is Great Babylon. It says that over and over again, and it's going to be split into three parts. So again, Babylon's on the whole earth. That means the whole earth is split into three parts. This is talking about the seventh vial, which is simultaneous with the seventh trumpet. And again, it says all seven occur in 1 day and 1 hour. It's referring to the meteorite impact. And again, the great city refers to Babylon the Great, which covers the whole earth. It says it will be divided into three parts when that meteorite hits. Also in Revelation 11, when it says the bodies of the two witnesses will lie unburied in the great city, the great city, again, refers to Babylon the Great over the whole earth. It's not the Middle Eastern city of Jerusalem where Jesus was crucified. When it says where their Lord was crucified, that can also be translated where their Lord was destroyed. And it's talking about their Lord, the beast, because remember, Hosea tells us Yahweh is the beast. The two witnesses are the two candlesticks, which we are told are the eyes of Yahweh throughout the whole earth. They worship the beast Yahweh, and the beast government, the United Nations, will kill them at the end of 1260 years. That is the beast that will ascend out of the bottomless pit. The UN will ascend or gain power when that meteorite hits. They will take over at that point. But it also tells us they're going to kill the two witnesses, the Christians and the Jews, and they will lie unburied in the great city, which is Babylon the Great, which covers the whole earth, where the beast rules. It's also where the beast will be destroyed. In other words, where their Lord will be destroyed. So again, we've got to rely on the original language the text was written in, not these later translations. That's really important. We're told Babylon the Great sits on the beast. We're told the beast represents two things, the world government and Yahweh. Babylon sits on the beast. The beast covers the whole world. That means Babylon sits on the whole world. But we're also told Babylon sits on people of different nationalities. Well, if Babylon is sitting on the beast and sitting on people at the same time, then that means the people that Babylon sits on are of the beast. In other words, Babylon sits on the people who worship the beast, and the beast represents Yahweh. That means Babylon sits on those who worship Yahweh. In other words, the Abrahamic religions, which are highlighted here in pink. This is the great city where the two witnesses will lie unburied and where their Lord will be destroyed. This place, we are told in Revelation 11, is also spiritually called Sodom and Egypt. It's called Sodom for one reason, because we're told the rain of fire and brimstone will fall here. We're told the meteorite hits the Sea of Babylon. And the 10 plagues of Egypt describe exactly what will occur after a meteorite impact and the loss of sunlight. We're told this area is spiritually called Egypt, and in the latter days, the Israelites will be taken by ships into this place as slaves. In Deuteronomy 31, Moses says the evil will befall them in the latter days. In other words, the curse of chapter 28 will be fulfilled in the last days. And part of that curse included being sold into slavery and brought by ships into a nation their fathers did not know, a nation that will be swift as the eagle, that will be spiritually called Egypt. In the 1600s, the ships began arriving in the Americas. Some of those ships carried slaves, and a large portion of those slaves came from Africa. In chapter 28, verse 48, it says, "And he shall put a yoke of iron upon thy neck." This PBS article shows an illustration from an 1839 publication depicting a female slave wearing an iron muzzle, which was also around her neck. This looks very much like the yoke of iron mentioned in Deuteronomy 28. There were Israelites brought to America from Africa in ships. America is part of Babylon the Great, which is spiritually called Egypt. America is the nation their fathers did not know, and it is also the nation symbolized by an eagle. There should be no question, then, that the slavery of the Israelites that would befall them in the latter days is the slavery of the African Israelites brought to American Egypt in ships. That slavery, then, would represent the affliction. In Genesis 15, Abraham was told what would happen to his descendants in the far future. In verses 13 and 14, it says, "And he said unto Abram, Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward shall they come out with great substance." Most Christians and Jews think this refers to the ancient Israelites in ancient Egypt or ancient Babylon, but the Bible makes it clear that the ancient Israelites were physically in ancient Egypt for only 215 years. Their sojourning started with Abraham for a total of 430 years, but that was not the affliction of 400 years. There's so much debate over this because while the 430 years are clearly defined, the 400 years are elusive, and scholars have had to come up with silly theories like the affliction of 400 years started when Ishmael laughed at Jacob when they were children. And I don't blame them for trying to figure it out, but what makes better sense is that the affliction of 400 years is the curse described in Deuteronomy 28, when the Israelites are taken into slavery again by ships into an Egypt their fathers did not know in the latter days. According to the Gale Encyclopedia of U.S. Economic History, the first African slaves arrived on the North American continent in August of 1619. If that began the affliction, then 400 years later would end in 2019. Since the final time of trouble will be an affliction on everyone over the whole earth and will last 3.5 years, then for that 400-year affliction to end in 2019, the final time of trouble would have to start at least 3.5 years before the end of 2019. Because Deuteronomy 30 tells us only some of them will go to heaven during that time. Some of them go through that final 3.5 years of trouble on the earth. So that final 3.5 years of trouble has to be included into that 400-year period, because if it went beyond that, it wouldn't be 400 years, it would be longer. So if 2019 is the end of the affliction, then the final time of trouble should start 3.5 years before the end of 2019. In other words, 3.5 years before December 2019. And that lands sometime between now and the spring of 2016. And this lines up with everything else so perfectly. There's no way it's coincidence. Now it makes sense why the recent fulfillments of Daniel 9 point to Obama as the man called Messiah, because the end-time affliction of Abraham's descendants happened here in the United States. New York City is the headquarters of the beast, the United Nations, who have devoured the whole earth and destroyed by peace. And the recent fulfillments of Daniel 12 pointed to the One World Trade Center in New York as their sacred place where the idol of terror was set up exactly 1,290 days after Obama took the oath, which is exactly what the original language says. This is among the many other reasons why December 11th starts possibly the biggest watch we've ever looked at. Today, December 11th, 2015, is the start of the 10th month on the Jewish calendar that is occurring in Obama's 7th year. The story of Esther and the Queen seems to be a parable representing the bride and Babylon the Great, and we're told the bride Esther was taken in the 10th month in the 7th year of the king. And remember, the king in the story represents God, because it says, and the king remembered Vashti and what she had done. That's a clear reference to God remembering Babylon's iniquities. So the king Ahasuerus represents God in this story. Okay, but get this. Who is the Messiah? The Messiah represents God's Son, right? Okay, now look at Daniel 9. It says, the son of Ahasuerus was ruling as king when Gabriel gave Daniel the prophecy about the Messiah. And remember, Daniel wrote this at the end of the 70 years of captivity in ancient Babylon. So let's just chart this. Jeremiah gives the prophecy of 70 years. 70 years later, Daniel is given the prophecy of 70 weeks, which has to do with someone called Messiah. Daniel wrote this chapter when the son of Ahasuerus was king. Jesus told us a parable of a king who made a feast, which is very similar to the king Ahasuerus in the book of Esther. It's basically the same principle. The queen is left and the bride is taken. So this is a parable. Ahasuerus represents God, and the son of Ahasuerus represents Messiah. So it's clear right here that Messiah will be the king ruling at the end of the 70 years. You see what I mean? The son of Ahasuerus was king at the end of the 70 years when Daniel wrote chapter 9. And now, while the fulfillment of Daniel 9 is happening, the 7th year of the man called Messiah is occurring in the 70th year that the nations around Judah have been serving Babylon. So again, the nations around Judah are part of true Israel. They're part of the earth, which is the true house of Israel. But the prophecy doesn't say Israel will serve Babylon. It says the nations around Judah will serve Babylon. But this is the kicker. We know the 70 years started in 1945 because Babylon sits on the beast. The beast is the 8th king, and the 8th king was created in 1945, the United Nations. Right now, we just entered the 10th month in the 7th year of the man called Messiah, which is also 3.5 years prior to 2019, the end of the affliction. It is also the end of the 1260 years since 755 and the end of exactly 70 years of the nations around Judah serving Babylon sitting on the 8th king. It is the end of the exact length of one generation described in the book of Matthew from the budding of the fig tree Israel in 1948. Jesus tells us the fig tree does not produce fruit. So the fig tree Israel is not the bride Israel. It's not the true Israel. It's the fig tree, no fruit Israel that Jesus says will be cut off. We also appear to have entered the 7th year of Daniel's final week and the Jubilee year, according to other sources. So it's still not too late to repent for worshiping the beast. Please, I'm begging you to verify for yourself that this is the truth in the Bible. For more information, you can watch the playlist Bible's Countdown to the Meteorite and Rescue for free. It shows step by step, starting with Jesus, how the timeline was laid out and has already occurred in a very different way than the churches thought. So thank you so much to those who have been making this work possible. If you like this video, please consider providing support. I just want to let you know I have to update the PDF and the book on Amazon to include all of this important information so that people who speak different languages can receive this. And so you can have it in your hand in case something happens to the internet. So I absolutely have to take a few weeks to complete that. I feel like I need to get this recent playlist in a printable PDF so I can give it to you and you will have it in your hand before this thing happens. So that's what I'm going to try to do. So if anybody wants to provide support for that, I appreciate it very much. And again, thank you so much to those who have already been making this possible. I hope you're doing well, and I hope you have a good holiday. I'll talk to you later.